I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Since his college days, my good friend Julian Bond has been involved in civil rights and education, and we're delighted to have him as our guest today. What should I call you? Senator, Professor, or Mr. Chairman?
Julian, call me Julian.
Julian.
Yeah.
Nashville, Tennessee.
I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, January 14th, 1940. Born there because my parents at the time lived in Fort Valley, Georgia, and there was not a hospital that would take a black woman within easy distance of Fort Valley. You could go to Atlanta, of course, but she was from Nashville, so it was decided I would be born in Nashville, and I was born there at Hubbard Hospital at Mary Medical School.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the Bond family.
Well, my mother and father were academics. That is, my father had spent all his life as a college teacher, then a dean, then a college president. My mother had been became a elementary school teacher, grade school teacher, and later got a degree in library science, became a librarian. So they were bookie people. They had 3 children, myself, my younger brother James, who's 5 years younger than I am, my older sister Jane, who is 1 year older than I am. James is 5 years younger, I meant to say. Jane is 1 year older than I am. And we lived in various places dictated by my father's job. He was president of Fort Valley State College, used to be Fort Valley State College for Negroes, in Fort Valley, Georgia, close to Macon. Macon was the big city we used to go in. It was a big thrill to go to Macon. And then in 1945, he became president of Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. That was his alma mater. That was a school for black men. Private school at the time. It's now called state-related. The state of Pennsylvania has taken half of it over, most of it over. And then sometime in the 1950s or 60s, 50s, 57, he became dean of the School of Education at Atlanta University, and we moved from Pennsylvania back down to Georgia, and lived there until 1980-something, when I moved to Washington, D.C., and here I am.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about your life on the campus of Lincoln University.
It was a great life because it was like having, it was an all-men's school then. It's co-ed now, but it was all-men's school. It was like having 400 big brothers. And because I was the president's son, they treated me kindly. They called me Little Bond. And I had a great time with these older men. I can remember when school was out, I would haunt the dormitories where they left all their stuff behind. All their stuff, all these books they shouldn't have had, all these pictures they shouldn't have had. And so it was a great place, and it was, we had a gymnasium, which I had access to. So I had my own gymnasium. I felt as if it was mine. It wasn't, of course. But, and track field had a high jump pit, all the things you needed to run track, baseball diamond, all that kind of stuff. And so it was just a wonderful place to grow up. It was a wonderful place to live and to be surrounded by all these people and to have, the Black College used to be the only place where black big figures could appear, could make a speech, could appear. I have a picture of Paul Robeson with his arm around me, holding me and singing to me one of his songs, and I can remember feeling his chest vibrate against mine. It was, that deep, deep bass voice he had. I have a picture taken at Fort Valley of myself and W.B. Du Bois, and 2 other great figures, my father and E. Franklin Frazier was a great sociologist. The 3 of them in academic regalia, and my sister and I'm 4 and she's 5, being dedicated to a life of scholarship. And I have a certificate that my mother typed and these 3 men signed. So I've got Du Bois's autograph and Frazier's autograph, my father's autograph, my mother's autograph, signing it as a witness, pledging my sister and I to a life of scholarship. So it was just great being on this college campus because you saw all the famous black people of the day, not so much the popular singers or people like that, but the academic people, the professors, the other college presidents, the who's who in black literary America. Those people came and went on all the college campuses I lived at, and I got to see them and meet them. And because my father was president, they'd normally be a reception in our house, and they'd attend, and people come by and shake hands and so on. So it was really a wonderful, wonderful, pleasant life. You know, it's funny, Bob, a young woman I grew up with there named Susan Fales. Her father was a refugee from Germany. After World War II, a great many German Jews came to the United States, particularly academics looking for a new life to escape from the horrors of Nazi Germany. And this guy was one of them. And he had a pronounced German accent and had two kids, Evan and Susan Fales. And he wore lederhosen, which I'd never seen those before. You know, leather shorts. I'd never seen many kids wearing shorts. But to see a kid wearing lederhosen, that was, whoa, what is that? Anyway, she is now writing a book about growing up at Lincoln. And she's talked to all of my contemporaries, the people I went to grade school with and secondary school with, and one or two I went to high school with, talking about growing up on this college campus. For me, it was heaven. I was just crazy about it. I was in love with it. Every single one of them describes an awful experience. This was bad. Somebody molested them when they were a child. Something else bad happened over here. This happened over here. And I can't imagine. They had such different experiences than I did.
Where did you go to school there?
I went to, when we moved there, which is 1945, I guess, the local public school was segregated. There was a black school on one side of the street and a white school on the other side of the street. And the black kids went here and the white kids went there. And the school system decided who went where by giving the kids tests. And the black kids always failed the test and they went to the black school. And the white kids passed the test, they went to the white school. And each of these schools had one teacher. These are one-room country schools. And each of them had an outhouse. So when we moved there, my father filed a lawsuit against this. This is before Brown versus Board of Education. And before the case could come to trial, the school system decided to close down the black school, fired the black teacher, and let all the kids go to the black school. So I went to this little one room, actually it was two rooms, one on top of each other. So many grades down here, so many grades up here. And I can remember my first teacher, Ms. McCloskey, great big chubby woman who had a loud voice and commanding voice. So I went to this school where everybody, you know, sat in one room, and I think first, second, third, fourth grades in one room and the other grades upstairs. And looking back on it, I thought, you know, what a wonderful way this was to go to school, because when I was in the first grade, I'm hearing the lessons taught to the kids in the second grade and the third grade and the fourth grade. So by the time I got there, I'd already heard this stuff. I knew all about it. I'm not saying we should go back to that, but it was a wonderful, wonderful way to go to school. That's where I went to school until I was ready to go to high school. And the local high school that I would have gone to would be Lower Oxford Consolidated High School in Oxford, Pennsylvania. And it was just not a good school. It was a small town Pennsylvania country school. And my parents decided I should go to something better, and they enrolled me in the George School, a co-ed prep school near Philadelphia. So I went there for 5 years and finished high school there, and that's how I went to school in my early years.
Mm-hmm. That was a Quaker school.
Yes, it was, yeah.
Did that help mold your social philosophy?
Indeed, in a way, it was the first place I ever heard anything about nonviolence, because Quakers are nonviolent people. It's what's called a peace church. They're the people who don't go to war, don't obey the draft, don't believe in fighting. Wonderful people, and they have a highly developed social conscience. I'll bet you, pound for pound, they've done more for social justice in the United States than almost any other church, including churches with many, many more members, many, many more people who belong to them. They're just wonderful people with wonderful ideas and wonderful thoughts. So yes, when the Civil Rights Movement came along later and people said, let's practice nonviolence, I was one of the few people who knew what that meant, because I'd heard about it, I'd met people who'd done it, and it meant something real to me. And it was a wonderful experience going to the school. I got a superior education, better than I would have gotten if I'd gone to the local high school. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So after graduation, you moved to Atlanta.
Yes, the year I graduated from high school, my father became the Dean of Education at Atlanta University, and we packed up and moved down there. And I tell you, I was terrified. I had read, my family took all these black newspapers, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Afro-American, the Baltimore Afro-American, and I read these atrocities that had happened in the South, these awful lynchings and beatings, and scary, scary things. And I thought that would happen in Atlanta, and I was terrified to go. And I can remember when we moved to Atlanta, and I was getting ready to go to college, to Morehouse College, I needed a suit. And I said to my mother, "Mama, you go get it, because they won't hurt you, you're a woman." I was afraid to go.
But it wasn't that way.
Wasn't that bad at all, no.
Good. So you enrolled at Morehouse.
Yes. I enrolled at Morehouse because my father, for some reason, when I was in high school, nobody talked to me about going to college, although it was intended that everybody in my high school would go to college. I don't know if I missed it or something. So by the time I left the high school, I was not ready to go. I was not prepared to go to any college. So we moved to Atlanta, and my father said, put me in a car and drove me by what I later knew was Atlanta University. Beautiful campus, green grass, beautiful buildings, brick buildings, lovely. He said, "That's Morehouse College." I said, "Ooh, I want to go there." So I applied to Morehouse, and I got in, and that's how I got at Morehouse.
Good. Well, tell us about your student days at Morehouse.
Well, they were wonderful days. I was taught by smart people, and you know it's always better to be taught by somebody smart. And I was going to school with smart people, smart guys. I was in an all-male university. There were women who would come from Spelman College, which was all women's college, and go to our classes, but never more than 2 or 3 women in a class. And it was a wonderful experience. I remember my math teacher, and I was not a good math student, my math teacher was Professor Dansby, and he told us, he said, "You know, I go down to Cape Canaveral every now and then," which he did. He consulted down Cape Canaveral. And of course, we were astounded. Cape Canaveral, you know, they shoot off the rockets there. He said, "I won't tell you I'm important, but you notice they don't send one of those things up until I'm down there." So I had people who were convinced they were going to teach me everything they knew. And if I didn't know everything they knew, I hadn't been well taught. And they were just good teachers, teaching me things that I couldn't have picked up by myself or learned by myself. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You founded a magazine there.
Yes, I founded a magazine or joined a magazine that was under the sponsorship of my English teacher, Esther Seaton, who I believe still lives in Atlanta. I'm in occasional correspondence with her. And she put together this literary magazine called Pegasus. I don't know where she picked that name from. I know where it comes from, but I don't know where she picked it from. At least I think I know where it comes from, some mythical figure. And it was a literary magazine, and I had a couple of articles in it. And so it played to what I thought was my strength. I knew I liked to write. I thought I was a good writer, and I thought I'm going to earn my living doing this some way or the other. So it was the beginning of thinking about a career.
Did you live on campus?
No, I lived at home. I lived about 5 blocks from the school, so it was easy to walk from home to there and even come home for lunch. I never ate in the dining hall.
Really?
In all the years I was there.
Well, before we leave Morehouse, I want to ask you about Dr. Benjamin Mays.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Mays was the longtime president of Morehouse College. He was just a marvelous man. He spoke we had compulsory chapel 5 days a week, and he spoke in chapel, I'd say 1 day a week. And it's just marvelous, wonderful stuff. You just let your mouth hanging open, these wonderful wordsmiths come from this man, this wonderful ways of thinking of things, of talking about things that you would never think about yourself. It was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. And he held up a standard of what a Morehouse man ought to be. And you wanted so badly to come up to that standard. You might fool around a little bit over here, or do something wrong over here, or do something wrong over there, but you didn't want Dr. Mays to know. You wanted to be right up there where he thought you should be. It was a great experience going to school with him. But I need to tell you about the class Dr. King taught. Dr. King, Martin Luther King, taught one class at Morehouse. There are 8 people in the class. I'm one of the 8. So Bob, I'm one of 8 people in the universe, in the whole universe, who can say I was a student of Dr. King's. Now I wish I could tell you I took extensive notes and I kept them until today, or I had a tape recorder, I tape recorded the pearls of wisdom that fell from this marvelous man, but I didn't do any of that stuff. I don't remember anything that passed between student and teacher in class, but I remember one day, school was over, we're walking across the beautiful campus, and he turned to me, he said, "Julian, how you doing?" Oh, I said to him, I said, "Doc, how you doing?" His friends called him Doc. I never really called him Doc. I'm telling you a joke here. And he said, I said, "Doc, how you doing?" He said, "I'm not doing well." He said, "Unemployment is high, racism's everywhere, segregation is movable. I feel awful," he said. "I have a nightmare." I said, "No, Doc, turn that around, try I have a dream." So there you go.
Well, there must have been some training that all of you in the movement received from Morehouse.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. King, you, many others. Where did that come from?
Well, it came from being surrounded by these figures, because Morehouse, like Lincoln, when I lived at Lincoln, just a who's who in Black America came to the campus and spoke to us. And at Morehouse, a who's who in Black America, a few years later, different generations came and spoke to me at Morehouse College. So if you name a prominent person, black person, in the 1960s, I saw that person speak in my college campus. I don't mean I got to know them or was friends with them, but I saw them, I heard them. And they were impressive people. And they held up a standard for me. This is what I could be. If I work hard, if I study hard, if I lift myself up a little bit, I can be like this. So it was a wonderful example of what you could be if you put your mind to it.
I know you've told this thousands of times,
Mm-hmm.
but would you please tell us, here and now, your first involvement in the civil rights movement?
I have told it many, many times. It gets better every time.
Doesn't everything?
Yeah. It was some day in February, early February of 1960. Across the street from Morehouse, there used to be a drugstore called Yates and Milton's. This was a black-owned drugstore chain. I think the Yates and Milton's owned 6 drugstores in Atlanta. And it also had a small cafe. And it was a place where students went between classes or instead of classes. And I was sitting in there one day, drinking a cup of coffee, I think. And a student came up to me, a guy named Lonnie King, whom I didn't know, but I knew who he was because he had been a football player, and the football players are well known and famous at Morehouse College. And he held up this newspaper, and he said, "Have you seen this?" And I thought he was talking about, do you read a newspaper? I said, yeah, I've seen that. He was really talking about a story. It said, Greensboro students sit in for third day. And it told how black college students in Greensboro, at North Carolina A&T College, for the 3rd day in a row, had sat in at the local F&W Woolworths department store. And it told how they dressed, how they looked, how they acted, how they behaved. It was like a primer, how to sit in. So I said, yeah, I've seen that. He said, what do you think about it? I said, I think it's pretty good, pretty good. He said, do you think it ought to happen here in Atlanta where we are? I said, sure, yeah, somebody's going to do it. He said, why don't we do it? And before I could say, what do you mean we? He said, you take this side of the cafe, I'll take the other side, and we'll go try to draw a meeting together. I should say there's another guy with him named Joe Pierce, who was also a student at Morehouse. And so Joe Pierce, Lonnie King, and myself began going around to other students saying, have you seen this story? What do you think about it? Don't you think we ought to do it here? If you do think so, let's have a meeting at such time and such place. So we got about 20 people together. And over the next several years, we tried to make sure, I should have said, I was going to Morehouse, all men, across the street from Clark, co-ed, across the street from Spelman, all women, down the street from Morris Brown, co-ed, down the street further from Atlanta University Graduate School, and down the street from the Interdenominational Theological Center, 4 theological schools in one center. So here are all these schools together, and we made sure we had people from each of these things, because whatever we were doing, we didn't want it to be just Morehouse or just Spelman or just 2 or 3 schools. We wanted everybody to be involved, and we knew there was real safety in numbers. So we made sure we had people from all these schools. We had a series of meetings, and by the beginning of February, we were ready to have sit-ins. And we knew how to do it. And I'll tell you something peculiar, Bob. Since then, I teach civil rights history. And so I know more about it than I did then. And I learned more about it from people who are active in it, like myself, as well as from the books I've read. And in most of the cities where there were sit-ins, the students had extensive training in nonviolence. They had mock nonviolent sessions. They'd roll up newspaper and use them as clubs, and pretend to hit each other. They'd shout at each other. They'd call each other names. They'd pretend to spit on each other. In Atlanta, we didn't do any of that. Somebody said to me, if somebody hits you, don't hit back, okay? Okay, that was it. That was my training in nonviolence. So we got ready to do it. We picked a number of places downtown. I think Lonnie went from place to place, and for some reason, we didn't go to a Woolworths or W.T. Grant's or Cress's. We didn't go to any of those places because we weren't sure what the law really was. Did the law allow you to go in that place, even if it was segregated? Would you be in some kind of deeper trouble than if you went to a state-supported place, a publicly supported place? We knew that the Brown decision in 1954 had eliminated segregation in public places, not just in schools, but in all public places. So a public place, a city hall or a state capitol cafeteria, those places would be safe for us to go in, legally safe. Or there was precedent for going in there. We had the right to be there. So I led a group in the Atlanta City Hall cafeteria. And I don't remember if you remember the old Atlanta City Hall. There were steps going up the front, and you came in, and you really, when you came in there, you were on the second floor, and you took an elevator down, and you'd be in the basement, or the first floor, really, but they call it the basement. And there was a cafeteria down there. And so I took a group of about 20 students, men and women, from Spelman, mostly in Morehouse, into the cafeteria. I went first. And we get into the room and we see these black women behind the steam tables. And they're looking at us with a mixture of admiration and fear. Admiration because they had read in the papers about sit-ins up and further north of the South, in North Carolina and so on. They knew about these things, and all of a sudden they were happening in Atlanta, and they were excited. But fear, because they knew if the sit-ins were happening, the police were not far behind, and black people, don't like being around police, or at least didn't then. And so they're uneasy about what we're doing. So we go down to the steam table, pick up our food, come to this white woman who's sitting at a cash register, and we later found out she was the manager of the cafe. And she said, "I'm awfully sorry, this is for City Hall employees only." And I said, "You got a big sign out front that says City Hall cafeteria, the public is welcome." She said, "We don't mean it." So I said, "I'll stand here till you do." Yeah. And she called the police, and the police came and locked us up and took us away. And I found myself separated from the women in a big pen in the jail downtown with other men. And God knows why they were there. And we knew better than to ask them, "Why are you here, my good fellow?" We knew that was not the thing to do. But they knew why we were there. They had heard on the radio, and they were so happy to see us. They were proud of us. And it was really this reinforcement that made this such rewarding work, that even these guys who had done God knows what were happy to see us, were proud of us for doing it, and we're saying, good for you, we're so happy.
Before that, what did the school administrators think about your activism?
Well, Dr. Rufus Clement, who was the president of Atlanta University, and in effect, the president of all the schools, even though each had its own administration, own president, he had heard about our planning, our plotting, and he called us into his office, and he said, "I know what you're going to do." He said, "I can't stop you from doing it, but I want you to find some way to tell the public why you're doing what you're doing." Well, I actually thought that was silly, because I thought if you sit at this lunch counter, you're not supposed to. Everybody knows why you're doing it. You're not supposed to, and you want to. But anyway, so a young woman and I named Herschel Sullivan, a Spelman student, wrote a big document called An Appeal for Human Rights. And we listed a number of things that were hindrances to black people, segregated restaurants, segregated movie theaters, on and on, down a long list, segregated housing, everything segregated in Atlanta. And we said, at the end, we pledged to do all we can to eliminate these things and to do everything we can to get rid of them. And we got the presidents of each of the schools, student bodies, presidents, to sign this thing. And Rufus Clement got Lillian Smith. Remember Lillian Smith?
Lillian Smith and I came from the same hometown.
Really?
Clayton, Georgia.
Well, she gave the money to print that ad in the paper, and printed it in the Morning Journal, the Afternoon Constitution, and the Atlanta Daily World. Those three papers was a full-page ad. And I tell you, Bob, it created a sensation. The governor whose name was Ernest Vandiver then. He was known to us as No Not One Vandiver, right, because he had pledged, no not one black child will go to school with white children while I'm governor. He had to eat those words. But anyway, he said, this sounds as though it has been written in Moscow, if not Peking. I thought, man, I've never been to Moscow or Peking, and I helped to write it, so why would he say something like that? Mayor Hartsfield, on the other hand, the mayor of Atlanta took a very different view, saying that this is a product of our own young people, and we ought to pay attention to it. We ought to listen to it. So anyway, that was printed, and then later we got arrested, as I told you, and went to jail. And that was the beginning of my participation in the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm. Did you and your fellow students ever consider the economic damage you could possibly do as a result of white reaction to your activism?
You mean damage to ourselves? Or
damage to the race?
No, never. I think had we been in different circumstances, had we been in a small town in rural Georgia or the rural South, there was possibility an angry white community could hurt us, hurt black people. Mm-hmm. But in Atlanta, no, we never thought of that. We never considered there be any retaliation against black people generally. And it's funny, I'm just reading this book about new book about Rosa Parks that one of my teaching assistants has written, and she writes at great length about what white Montgomery people did to black people generally because of the bus boycott. Many maids lost their jobs because they were walking to work instead of taking the bus. Rosa Parks lost her job and could not find a job in Montgomery after the bus boycott. No one would hire her, black or white. Her husband, who worked at the Air Force Base, lost his job. He could not find another. He was a barber. He could not find another job. So white Montgomery reacted in a harsh way to the boycott, and many people had to suffer because of that. But in Atlanta, I don't think we consider that for a moment.
Tell us about the reaction of the African American leadership, political leadership during that period.
The political leadership, generally speaking, responded negatively to what we had done, but with differences among that negativity. Some people said, well, this is a great thing you did, but you've done it once, so that's enough. You've proved your point, don't do it again. Some people said you shouldn't have done this in the first place, it was a big mistake, should have left it up to me, I could have taken care of it. Because so many of these people had built their reputation on being go-betweens between black and white Atlanta. Mm-hmm. They had set themselves up, sometimes self-anointed, to be leadership figures, and said to the white people, I know these people, I can take care of these things. But generally speaking, in the political leadership class, there was objection to what we had done, and the feeling that we shouldn't do it again, and we shouldn't be allowed to go our own way. We should always listen to them. There was a secondary kind of leadership, younger black people, like some of the professors at Clark College, Clark Holman, who had, and Whitney Young, who became head of the Urban League, but who was at Atlanta University. They had formed a group called, I can't remember the name of the group, but they had printed a booklet called A Second Look at Atlanta. And that Second Look at Atlanta was a critique of segregation in Atlanta and listed all the awful things that segregation in Atlanta meant. And it was from that book that Herschel and I took the ideas for our statement that was printed in the newspapers. And this little group of people, as I say, younger professors, people who didn't hold any office, because no black person held any office then except Rufus Clement. He was on the school board. I think A.T. Walden was on the Democratic County Committee or something, but nobody else held any position, elected position at that time. But these younger academic guys, like Holman and Whitney Young, were solidly with us and encouraging to us and helped us in innumerable ways, just many ways.
Getting back to the Atlanta campaign, you have integrated the City Hall. Mm-hmm. You have sat in some public places. What happened after that?
Well, after that, we decided we would do what our colleagues in say Greensboro and Charlotte and other cities north of Atlanta had done, and that was to focus on lunch counters, because that was the whole idea of the sit-ins from the beginning. And so we began to map out how many seats there were and how many restaurants in Rich's and all the other downtown department stores, as well as the dime stores, but places like Macy's or Davidson's, it was called then. And so we began to map out how many seats there were, how many people it'd take to fill them up and so on. We began to plot a campaign against them. But Rich's was really the target. Rich's was the biggest department store in Atlanta. It was a place most people stopped. It was a popular place with black people. People loved it. You know, its motto was, the only thing you can't return here is your husband. So women loved it, you know. And so we decided to pick on Rich's. And Mr. Rich heard about it. And he called us in. And he lost his temper. And he said something I know he was sorry for later. He said, I don't care if another Negro ever comes in my store. We said, we'll see how you feel about it when it happens. So we began a boycott of the downtown and a series of hit and run sit-ins at Rich's. That is, you'd go and sit down at the lunch counter, wait till they called the police. When the police came and said leave, then you'd leave. You go over here to the other restaurant at Rich's and do the same thing, and then back again, and drove the police crazy. And we got Martin Luther King, who had who had moved back to Atlanta from Montgomery after the success of the boycott, and got him to join us and to be arrested with us. And we got Martin Luther King arrested at Rich's, and I understand that Richard Rich cried when he heard that the chairman of his board had ordered Martin Luther King to be arrested at his store, because this was news nationwide, all over the country. Sure. And of course, you know the story. The fact that King is in jail and has been put in jail in Atlanta becomes instant news. And I was told that the telegrams saying this was a great idea or this was a terrible idea were just pouring into City Hall from around the country, almost around the world. Mm-hmm. It became involved in the Kennedy campaign. John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon were running against each other for president. And Kennedy had two people working for him, Harris Wofford, who lives here in Washington, and Louis Martin, who is a Chicago newspaper publisher. Wofford white, Martin black, working for the Kennedy campaign, decided what they could do to use this in some way to do something about it. So first, Robert Kennedy, who was the campaign director, said, don't you do a damn thing. Don't you do a single thing. Don't just talk to anybody. Don't issue any statements. Don't put out any press release. Don't do anything. Because whatever you do is going to hurt my brother Jack, and he won't win the presidency. So they decided they'd go around this way. So they found out that Nixon had said nothing, no comment. Nothing. He wouldn't say anything at all about this. Kennedy issued a kind of half-hearted statement, I'll look into it or something like that. So they put out a leaflet called No Comment Nixon versus the candidate with a heart, John F. Kennedy. And they printed it on blue paper, and they printed 10,000 copies, 20,000 copies, 50,000 copies, on and on, all printed in Chicago. Remember, this is before fax machines, before the internet. They sent these leaflets by Greyhound bus all around the South, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, all around the country. Not the country, all around the area near to Chicago. And in the 1956 election, black people had voted Republican 60-40. 60% of black people voted Republican, 40% voted Democrat. In this election in 1960, that was reversed. It was 70-30. And you know, you don't see reversals like that in American politics. No. And it was that blue bomb that did it. That leaflet went down in history as the blue bomb. And Louis Martin, Sergeant Shriver, I think, told the story of sitting outside a black church in Chicago and watching people go in with this blue piece of paper in their hand. He said, something's happening now. And it did happen. That was the election of John F. Kennedy.
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Mm-hmm.
You were a founder.
Yes.
Tell us.
We got a letter from a woman named Ella Baker, whom I'd never heard of before, and Martin Luther King, signed by the two of them. I found out who she is later, a wonderful woman, but I had no idea who she was. And it invited us, the Atlanta sit-in people, to a conference to be held on Easter weekend in Raleigh, North Carolina, on the campus of Shaw University. So Lonnie King, myself, Ben Brown, about 6 or 7 other people, maybe 6 people, borrowed somebody's car, and drove up to Raleigh and moved into dormitories at Shaw University. And once we got there, we met other students like ourselves who'd come from other college campuses, who'd been involved in other sit-in demonstrations in their locales. And it was like seeing people you'd just seen on TV or just seen their pictures of paper. Ooh, there's somebody, there's somebody, there's somebody. Because we knew these people by name. We had followed these sit-ins in other cities. And the upshot of it was that we decided to create a new organization. The NAACP had representatives at this meeting, and they're saying, come on, join the NAACP. And the Congress of Racial Equality had people, and they're saying, come on, join the Congress of Racial Equality. Dr. King had started a new organization in '57. This was '60, and he was saying, come on, join my organization. You can be the youth chapters. And Ella Baker said, no, don't do that. Said, join your own organization, create your own organization. Don't fall under the spell of these older people. If they had done what you were going to do, they would have already done it, and they didn't do it, and you did. So we created an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We elected Marion Barry, who now is a city councilman here in Washington, was a mayor in Washington, as the chairman, and set up an office in Atlanta, initially in the issue a desk in Martin Luther King's head office, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and then a standalone office on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta. And we hired a young white woman named Jane Stembridge, who was a student at Union Theological Seminary, to be the director. And eventually she left and was replaced by a guy named Ed King. You know, a lot of people named King in the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King, Slater King, C.B. King, Ed King. None of these people, the two King, Slater King and C.B. King, are brothers, but the Martin Luther King and Ed King have no relation to those Kings or any other Kings, as far as I know.
King.
Lonnie Kings, yeah, Lonnie King, and no relation to the others. Anyway, so Ed King took Jane Stembridge's place and became the director of this new organization, and I began to hang out at the office, and I began to spend more and more time at the SNCC office, writing things. Thought I was good at writing, and I could write press releases, and finally I was spending more time there than I was at my schoolwork, and I dropped out of college in the second semester of my senior year.
Ooh.
Yes, that's what my
Dr.
parents.
Mann didn't care for that.
No, not at all. I didn't care for it, not at all. But you know, the time demanded it, and so that's how I got involved in SNCC.
But you went back and finished.
Yes, I went back and finished.
Okay. This question about SNCC.
Mm.
You know, incidentally, I read where Jimmy Carter had once said that if you want to scare a South Georgia farmer, you don't say Martin Luther King, you say SNCC.
That's right. I'm so proud of that.
That made you look like a very powerful
Oh yes,
organization.
I quoted that in a speech I gave over and over again. I'll tell you something else. There's on the John F. Kennedy White House tapes, he's talking about Birmingham. And the people are saying, well, yet last night in Birmingham, this thing happened, and the people from SNCC, and Kennedy says, what's that? They said, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Kennedy says, they're sons of bitches, aren't they?
Doesn't that show that he knew very little about your organization?
Yes, it did. But anyway, that's true about Carter.
Well, did you have an overall plan for SNCC, or did it just develop?
It developed as time went on. Our initial plan was to do what our name said, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We thought we would be the coordinating agency for these various student groups that had sprung up to carry on the sit-ins. So we'd say, okay, let's do this all together. Oh no, let's do this all together. And we did do that sometimes. For example, on Election Day in 1960, we got each of these groups to hold protest at the polls in their cities, saying, you know, black people can't vote. This is wrong, we should do something about it. So we did do that for a while, but only for a very short while.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the other projects you undertook?
Well, we almost immediately became embroiled in the next big thing that happened, which was the Freedom Rides. The Congress of Racial Equality had a Freedom Rides in 1947 called a group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Had this Freedom Ride in 1947 that went through the Upper South from, I think, D.C. into the Carolinas, not much deeper than that. And we decided to repeat, Congress of Racial Equality decided to repeat this in 1961. and they assembled a group of people. John Lewis from this new organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was one of them. And they, in 2 buses, Greyhound and Trailways bus, began in Washington, D.C., and had planned to go all the way to New Orleans, and that would be the end of it. And they had very little trouble until they got to Alabama. And in Anniston, a bus was burned and destroyed, and several of them sent to the hospital. And in Birmingham, they were beaten and treated badly. And in Montgomery, they were beaten and treated badly. And the original sponsors of the ride, the Congress of Racial Equality, decided to call it off and to continue the trip by airplane. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee decided we would take it up where they had left it off. And one of our Nashville members, Diane Nash, called the head of the Congress of Racial Equality, Jim Farmer, and asked him if he would mind if we took it up. And he said, okay, I wouldn't mind at all. I think he was reluctant that his group had called it off. And so we did take it up, and we took it up from Montgomery forward and never made it further than Jackson. But hundreds and hundreds of people followed us and came down from Chicago, from New York, from Philadelphia, from around the country. There's a great map I have which shows paths of freedom riders just pouring into New Orleans, Jackson, into Jackson, from all directions south, even from Florida, coming up from Florida. So the freedom rides became a big, big phenomenon, and easily 1,000 people engaged in these rides, and easily 500 of them were arrested and went to jail at Parchman Penitentiary.
Were you surprised at the outpouring of sympathy?
Yes, I was.
From white as well as black students?
Yes, absolutely. And even in the earlier sit-ins, I was surprised at the outpouring of sympathy from whites. I had hoped for it, I wanted it, but I didn't expect it, but it was so great. And the key to me, and I think the key to the whole thing, was this nonviolence. The fact that we were nonviolent, the fact that we wouldn't hit back, the fact that we take this punishment, and the punishment was severe, and carry on. I think people found that admirable. Some people thought it nutty and crazy, but I think most people found it admirable. Maybe something they wouldn't do themselves, but something they admired in other people doing. Mm-hmm. And the idea that you could love your enemy and carry on this fight for justice and civil rights, I think was admirable to people, and it created a large cadre of admirers whom we would not have had ordinarily.
Mm-hmm. Voter Education Project.
The Voter Education Project was begun by the Southern Regional Council, which wanted to find some ways to increase the number of registered black voters. And so they created this entity under the guise of studying black voting patterns. But of course, that was really nothing to do with it. It was studying how to register black voters, really. And they did that. They got the right tax category, I forget what, I guess 501c3. And they hired a director, a man named Wiley Branton, who had been one of the lawyers for the Little Rock 9 in Little Rock, Arkansas, and set up an office in Atlanta, and had meetings. I think really the Kennedy administration had initiated this, had pushed for this, because they knew if they could register black voters in the South, first, the freedom rides were terrifying to the Kennedy administration. They just couldn't stand all this violence and blood and stuff, and they didn't want that to go on. They wanted to take the movement out of the streets into the polling places, and they thought that voting would be the way to do it. They didn't realize then, I don't think we realized then, how sensitive black voting could be in Mississippi and Alabama particularly, how fiery it could be. I don't think anybody recognized that. And so, but they thought if you shifted the movement to voting away from the freedom rides, then things will calm down. John F. Kennedy will get these votes. Black people will vote for him, and he'll be reelected. So they started this new organization, and we were initially reluctant about it because we knew that was just a trick to get us involved in Democratic Party politics. And probably we wanted John F. Kennedy to be reelected, but we didn't want to say it. We didn't want to know it. We didn't want to become lackeys for the Democratic Party. So we were a little hesitant at first, but eventually we were won over, and we went ahead and did it, and became probably, in Mississippi where the biggest fights were held, we probably registered more people than anybody else because we had more people working there. The NAACP had more members there, but we had more people working there because we had, I'd say, 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 people on our payroll there, working for voter registration. That was our next step.
In the final analysis, how much did the Kennedy administration contribute to the civil rights movement?
It's hard to say, because in many ways, to me, they were a great disappointment. He was a great disappointment. He had found, I read something in a book about him, that he believed that he could go forward with the civil rights by executive orders, because he couldn't get things through Congress, and that he'd rather try it through executive orders. If he went through Congress, his tax program would be in trouble. White Southerners would rule against him because of his civil rights activity. So he decided not to go that way. But we thought, why not try? Whether you can do it or not. I think he was, a political person after all, and I wanted to win. He was like Lyndon Johnson says, nothing worse than a dead liberal. And so he was disappointing to us, and his administration was disappointing to us. He did things when he was made to do them. And I think we always thought he could do more, and wondered, had he lived, what would he have done? It's counterfactual, you can't know, you can't say, but you just have to wonder.
I remember a poster in your basement on Sunset Avenue. Do you remember that poster?
What did it say?
I can't remember exactly. It said something to the effect that hands that once picked cotton
can now pick presidents.
Yeah,
right.
That was,
that was a poster drawn by Herman Bailey. Great poster.
Yeah, it was good. Well, let's move along.
Very quickly, we were pioneers at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in using posters, music, all these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. We did this long before any organization did it, even ones as old as the NAACP, but sorry.
Well, just wanted to move along now with the life of Julian Bond. Mm-hmm. You're now reached the point where you're involved in SNCC and the movement, and somehow you became political.
Yes. Well, the Georgia legislature, as you know, was terribly malapportioned, with the big cities receiving no power in the legislature, the rural South, rural Georgia, receiving great power in the legislature. And that's because the districts were drawn that way. A federal court ruled that that was wrong and changed it, asked the legislature to redraw the districts, and they did. And I found myself living in a new legislative district in Atlanta, one with no incumbent. No one had represented this district before. And I had a good friend named Ben Brown in the adjacent district who decided he would run for this House. And he convinced me to run for the House in my district, and I did run, and we both won. And this peculiar situation, because we were elected to one-year terms in what was normally a two-year legislature. But we would have to serve 1 year, and then we'd run if we wanted to, run again if we wanted to. And in December of the year I was elected, a friend of mine named Sammy Young, who had lost a kidney in the service to his country in the Navy and had to go to the bathroom more than most people, tried to go to the bathroom in Tuskegee, Alabama, at a white-only gas station, and the gas station owner shot him in the back and killed him. And the irony of this guy losing his life after having lost a kidney in service to his country was just too much. And that initiated the public airing of anti-war sentiment in my organization. And if I told you right now what we said, you'd say, that's nothing. People say that all the time now. But then it sounded harsh, it sounded radical and extreme. And the outcry in Georgia was just enormous. The people I was about to join in the legislature really raised hell and said these are terrible things to say, and the person who said them is a terrible person. And the movement began to exclude me from the legislature. And what they really wanted was an apology. And I didn't think I had to apologize or should apologize. I didn't think I'd done anything wrong, so why would I apologize? And I remember I was going into Pascal's restaurant in Atlanta, a famous restaurant, and I ran into Ralph Abernathy, Reverend Abernathy. And I said, what shall I do? They want me to apologize. I don't feel like I should. He said, just do something you can live with. So I said, hey, I'll do that. And I could live with saying, no, I believe in this. I'm happy, glad I said it. I'd say it again. And the legislature voted to throw me out, to declare my seat vacant, and to call a new election. So I ran in that election, and I won. And they threw me out again. And I ran in the third election, this time for a 2-year term. In the interim between running for the 2-year term and the last time they threw me out, there was a new election held, and I ran and I won, and I also filed a lawsuit, and it went to the Supreme Court, and the court decided 9-0 that I was right, that the legislature was wrong, and I should be seated. And so in January the following year, I took my seat and served there for the next 20 years.
What sort of reception did you get after all that?
From some people, I got a chilly reception. One in particular, James Sloppy Floyd, I think never could get along with the idea that I was there, because he was one of the movers to throw me out. He had been involved with the VFW. He was very patriotic, as many Southerners are, and just the idea of my being there just drove him the wrong way. So I could never get along with him. But most politicians, I think, are people who don't hold grudges for a long time. If they can get along with you some way or the other and they can get something out of it, okay with them. And I found out quickly that while there's a period when people wouldn't speak to me, wouldn't talk to me, that passed, and people began to look upon me as a vote. I was a vote. I could vote for them, I could vote against them, and it's better for them if I'd vote for them, and they could find some way to do that. My favorite story is I was sitting in the legislature, and a guy behind me, I don't remember who he was, what his name was, a bill came up to vote an appropriation for autistic children. This when autism was not well known or talked about, and this bill came up, and he said, "Bond, you should vote for this." So I voted for it. I looked up the tally sheet, the sign, and he had voted against it. I said, "Why'd you vote against it?" He said, "Bond, we have too many artistic children in Georgia."
That's no endorsement of the Georgia General Assembly.
No.
I'd like to ask this question.
Yeah.
At the time, there was a rumor that the governor and the speaker had offered you a chance just to step aside.
You know, Bob, I
avoid that.
I have a terrible memory, but I don't remember that. And I think I would remember that if it happened.
Yeah.
Leroy Johnson, you remember, who was the single black legislator then, had told me that he had been told that if I would apologize, then everything would be okay. Yeah. But I wasn't going to do that. So,
what sort of committee assignments did you get?
I got pretty good at committee assignments. I don't remember what they were in the House, but they were pretty good at committee assignments. I wasn't on the birthday committee or anything like that. And I grew to love it and enjoy it. I enjoyed it very much. You know, when you can introduce a bill and get it passed, that's a great thing. Right. Great thing. When you can change people's lives, and you can do in a state legislature, you can do it so much quicker than you can in the Congress. Mm-hmm. It was great.
Yeah. After service in the House, you decided to run for the Senate.
Yeah, it was like stepping upstairs.
Going upstairs.
Yeah.
Tell us about that election.
Well, I don't remember much about it, except the time came, I could do it. There was an opening, I can't remember who I succeeded. Do you?
Horace Ward.
Horace Ward must have stepped up to a judgeship.
Yes.
That's right, creating a vacancy. And I decided to run, and because I was already well known in a third of the district, so I thought to get well known, the other 2/3 wouldn't be that hard. And it wasn't that hard. And I enjoyed it. And the Senate, it's true, the Senate to me was, I don't want to say a better class of people, but different people who seem to have different views about things. Mm-hmm. Not as strong as, passions weren't as strong in the Senate as they were in the House. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In your first term in the House, you had the duty to select a governor between Lester Maddox, the well-known segregationist, and Bo Calloway, the well-known Republican segregationist. You remember how you voted?
I think I abstained, which really is a coward's way out. I was so conscious of having been put out myself, because later we had a matter involving a member of the Senate, Roscoe Dean, who question came up about expelling him. And I felt so strongly that, it was wrong to have done this to me. It was probably wrong to do it to him, and I think I voted to keep him there. Or maybe not. Maybe I voted to put him out. I thought what he had done was egregious. Yeah. He had lied on his expense slips. And what he had done was really wrong, and what I had done was not wrong. So they weren't comparable situations, but I felt very, very torn by it, being asked to do to him what had been done to me.
I think that was the time that he got expenses for driving to the Bahamas.
Yes, I believe so. I believe so. And it was as if he drove back to Savannah and back to Atlanta every day.
Yeah.
Which of course you can't do. You could do, I guess, but why would you?
It'd be a long trip.
Yeah.
By the way, how would you rate Lester Maddox as a governor?
Well, he was really a conundrum, a mixed guy. My favorite Lester Maddox story is that the Georgia black legislators went to see him to ask him about a number of things. And one of them was getting black people on draft boards in Georgia. The governor put people on draft boards, and there were no black people on the draft board. So he said, Governor Maddox, we want you to name some black people to the draft boards. He said, you all fight in the Army, don't you? I said, yes. He said, well, you should be on the draft board. I mean, to him, it was that simple.
Yeah.
And to him, I always thought he was more complex than people thought he was.
Then you ran for Congress.
Yeah. I ran for Congress. I had, for 2 times, going through 2 withdrawings of districts, I had played a role. A minor role the first time and a major role the second time. And I helped draw a district that I thought would elect me to the Congress of the United States. I created it carefully. I waited until all my colleagues in the Senate had drawn districts around Atlanta. Atlanta was like a donut hole. And then I went to work on the 2 districts left in the middle in Fulton and DeKalb counties, and created 2 districts, one of them for me. And I decided to run for Congress. And my old friend, John Lewis, whom I'll see tonight, decided he would run. And I was just astounded he would do it, because he had just been reelected to a city council term. And I couldn't imagine somebody getting reelected to office and giving that office up immediately afterward. I just couldn't think it would happen. But he did it. And of course, he had a right to. He could do what he wanted to. And it became a bitter, bitter campaign. He made allegations against me, or asked me to take a drug test. And I had a philosophical objection to drug tests. I have it now. I had it then, but I have it now. And I wouldn't do it, and I think he used that against me effectively. And he carried all of the white votes in the district and a small number of the black votes. I carried all the black votes and a tiny number of the white votes, and he won.
Mm-hmm. Runoff.
He runoff. Yeah, he ran in a runoff.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things I remember about your activities, and there have been many, was your performance at the 1968 National Democratic Convention, where you challenged the governor's delegation.
Georgia then picked delegations to Democratic conventions by having the governor name them, or the party chairman name them, really, which meant the governor. And Georgia had picked a delegation in a state that was a quarter black, picked a delegation that was overwhelmingly white, I think 3 black people in it, and a delegation that included people pledged to vote for George Wallace, who was not running as a Democrat, but as a third-party candidate. So it was undemocratic in many different ways. And with Taylor Branch, the author, and another guy who was a classmate of Taylor's, we decided that we would create a delegation that at least had one person in it who would vote for Eugene McCarthy, because we were fans of Eugene McCarthy. Taylor went to UNC. McCarthy had spoken at UNC, and he had fallen in love with him. And so we created a delegation. We had a convention in Macon. We created a delegation drawn from each of the congressional districts in Georgia. It was racially integrated. It was split between Robert Kennedy, Hubert Humphrey, and somebody else, I think, and McCarthy. So it was fairly apportioned to the Democratic candidates running for president. And we went to Chicago. Taylor and I, and Parker Hudson, that's the other guy's name, went to Chicago to break the way for us. And we stayed in we got the last room in the Conrad Hilton Hotel. I got the last room in the Conrad Hilton Hotel after spending one night at the YMCA. Don't ever do that, Bob. Don't ever spend that. It's awful. Anyway, remember the song YMCA? Tells you something. Anyway, we were looking for hotel rooms for our delegation, and buses to take us back from the hotel to the convention center. And we just couldn't find a place anywhere. A convention was coming to Chicago. There were no rooms that we had. This black guy recognized me and stopped us, asked us if he could help. We told him about it. He said, "Have you tried this hotel?" We said, "Yeah, we've been there. They don't have any rooms." He said, "Let me try." He went in, came out 15 minutes later. He said, "I got the rooms." I said, "Wow, that's great, but we don't have any money to pay for them." He said, "Why don't you ask my boss?" I said, "Who's your boss?" He said, "Elijah Muhammad." I said, "Elijah Muhammad? He calls white people blue-eyed devils. He doesn't allow his members to vote. Why would he give us money for this?" He said, "You try him." So I went over there, had dinner with him, left Taylor at home. Came back the next day. He said, "Come back the next day." Came back the next day, and he had dinner again. And it's this patriarchal religion. So the women sit over here and the men sit over here. And he said to the group, he said, "This young man wants the money to bring his people from Georgia up to here. What should we do?" And the women, almost to a woman, said no. So we don't know him. He'll give his money to the devils. We don't trust him, and we don't do that. We don't vote. We don't play politics. Then he asked the men. They were mixed, sort of yes and no. And he said to me, "Mr. Bond, in the Nation of Islam, we listen to the women." He said, "We do what the men say do." And he gave me $3,000 in $100 bills. I wired it to Atlanta, and all our people came up. And eventually, the Credentials Committee decided to split the Georgia delegation in half of the regulars, half of us. The regulars were so mad, most of them went home, leaving us with most of the seats. And then later, I was nominated for Vice President of the United States, but I was too young. I was below the age and had to decline.
Very great story. You know, the outcome of that event in Chicago, I think Lester Maddox walked out of the convention.
Yes, he did. Went home.
And I think 2 or 3 of our Georgia's elected constitutional officers switched parties.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember that, but they became
that early.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
No, I don't remember that.
But anyway, it was quite a time in our career, in your career.
Yeah.
Okay. After a long career in the civil rights movement and in politics, is there anything that you would like to go back and tell us about that we haven't discussed?
There are probably things I'll think about later when we've parted, and probably best unsaid. No, but I've had a wonderful career, and just saying that sounds like getting ready to die tomorrow, which I don't plan to do. But I've had a wonderful life so far, and think it's going to be wonderful in the future. So I can't think of anything else. No.
I'd like to ask you about the integration at the University of Georgia, and if you had a role in that with Donald Hollowell.
I didn't have a role in it, but my brother-in-law, Howard Moore, was a young lawyer then, and he was just starting practicing with Don Hollowell. And so I was sort of on the edge of that. And I remember going down to Georgia, the University of Georgia, as a reporter for the Atlanta Inquirer, and either accompanying Hollowell or traveling beside or in a caravan with him, and going to the university as he and Charlene, I think, applied for admission. Charlene Hunter, who became the first black student with Hamilton Holmes to go to Georgia. And I remember going to the campus with Hollowell, not with Hollowell. I don't know what circumstance put me with him there. I wasn't in the same car. And seeing him go in the registrar's office and come back out, and big hubbub, a lot of reporters, and pictures being taken and so on. And I had an inkling that something bad could happen here. There's much excitement about this. I didn't think it'd be as bad as it was, but I sort of said to myself, something bad can happen here. These people are too excited.
Mm-hmm. But the Governor Vandiver finally agreed to integrate the university.
Yes. Yeah.
But you know, and I'm sure you remember this, Horace Ward was the first African American to apply. Yes. And was denied.
Right, and then went to law school out of the state because he couldn't go in Georgia, and got to come back and argue for Charlene. That's a poetic justice.
It is, yeah. What can modern day activists learn from civil rights veterans like you?
I think they have to learn perseverance. You have to keep trying and trying and trying and trying and never give up. You have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing and never give up. I think there's a tendency today to look at the Eyes on the Prize videos, documentary about the civil rights movement, and most of what you see is Martin Luther King having press conferences. And you think, hey, that's the way to do it. Well, we have a press conference. Well, maybe you want to have that now and then, but that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to work. What these documentaries don't show you is the people knocking on doors, registering voters, doing the hard work that created a movement, that brought people from various interests together, that built coalitions. You don't see that. And that's what you have to do today. Mm-hmm. I think we've lost the ability to do that.
You were one of the founders and served as president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Tell us about that.
The Southern Poverty Law Center was started by two men, Joe Levin and Morris Dees in Montgomery. They were lawyers and friends, had gone to Alabama law school, and they decided that there's a need for a public interest law firm that would deal on initially poverty issues, because hence the name Southern Poverty Law Center. But they quickly saw that the real issue was race, and that race was the predominant issue, and they need to focus on that. Now they focus on many things, but that was the question. And Mars came to see me. We had lunch at Pascal's in Atlanta, and this is young white Alabama guy, whom I was a little wary of him. I'd never met him before, and he told me what he was going to do, and he wanted me to be the president. And I said, what are the duties? He said, well, you have to sign the fundraising letters. I said, fundraising letters? He said, yeah. He said, I intend to raise the money by raising direct mail. I said, really? He said, yeah. And what I did not know, and later found out, is that he was a genius at direct mail. That he told me he had sold cars in the mail. Now, can you imagine that, Bob? Mm-hmm. Selling cars through the mail? He had done it. It's just remarkable. I just got a letter from him, not from him, yesterday, signed by Toni Morrison, the great author. In past years, I got a letter from Rosa Parks that he had gotten Rosa Parks signed. Rosa Parks worked for the NAACP. I was chairman of the NAACP. We never got her to sign a letter for us. And here's Morris Dees getting her to sign letters for him. Anyway, so Morris turned out to be a genius at this and was able to raise money and build an endowment of about $50 million today, and built a staff. And for a long time, or rather a short time, the woman whom I'm now married to worked for Morris as a lawyer, and had a case that she took to the Supreme Court under Morris's tutelage. So the association has just been wonderful for me, and I'm happy for it.
Good. Let's go back to This Is Your Life, Julian Bond, to a point after the congressional race. What happened chronologically after that?
After that, I my marriage began to fall apart, and I filed for divorce and got divorced. I had to give up my legislative seat when I ran for Congress, and having lost the congressional race and given up the legislative seat, I literally was unemployed. I was able to earn a small amount of money by making speeches, so I wasn't, penniless, but I wasn't doing all that well anyway. And I began to get an offer to teach at American University, where we are right now, in DC. And I was also doing a TV show here called America's Black Forum, and I would come up here, say, once every other week, and come up and do two shows. This is a low rent TV show. Do 2 shows. And I reconnected with this woman who had worked for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and we decided to marry, and we did, and I decided to move here to be with her, and and the thing about American University came later. I began teaching at American University, also taught at Williams College for a semester, taught at Harvard for a semester, then taught at Drexel and Penn for a semester, Drexel in the afternoon, Penn at night, then back at Harvard for a semester. Then got an invitation to teach at the University of Virginia, and they didn't make it permanent. There were no permanent jobs, but made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and so I began teaching there. And so today I teach at American on Mondays and University of Virginia on Tuesdays. And in the spring, I'll retire from Virginia. And I'm happy to say that they have offered to create a Julian Bond Chair in Civil Rights Studies, for which I'm trying to raise money right now. So if you hear of anybody who has some to give, tell them to get in touch with me.
Okay. Well, you also have served for a number of years as the chairman of the NAACP.
Right. After the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee disappeared, I looked around. The NAACP was the only civil rights organization standing. And I re-entered it because I had been a member of the NAACP while I was in college. I was not active in it, but I was a member. And I became a member again of the Atlanta NAACP, and we were lucky enough in Atlanta to have this marvelous woman named John Dale Johnson, who was the executive director. So being the chairman, or president rather, of the NAACP was a relatively easy job because she ran the NAACP in Atlanta. And we had a wonderful, wonderful NAACP. And she encouraged me to run for the board. And I ran for the board of NAACP, and I won and served a couple of terms. And then I got into a dispute with the then chairman, and he ran somebody against me, and I was beaten and defeated off the board, got back on the board again, challenged him, helped defeat him, helped elect Myrlie Evers Williams as his successor. She served 2 terms, and then when she stepped down, I was asked to take her place. And I did, and I got elected to the board again and got elected chairman of the board and served for 11 years. Chairmen have 1-year terms. So I served 11 terms and then stepped down, and a bright young woman named Rosalind Brock succeeded me, and I'm now chairman emeritus. I've been kicked upstairs, but luckily I have few responsibilities and not much to do.
Good. If you will, please go back with me to SNCC again. I'd like to get your views on what happened to SNCC, how it changed from the organization that you knew into a Black Power type organization, and why you resigned.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee changed over time in many ways, most of them positive, I think. It began as this coordinating agency, then it became an organization with a staff that did things itself. But the time came in the 60s when Black Power sentiment was about, and it began to grow inside the organization. And there were great disputes within the organizations about what way we ought to do. Some people said Black Power is perfectly innocuous, which is a position I held. It's not horrible, it's not bad. It simply means black people running their own things. In other words, black people ought to be able to run the cities where they're a majority of. If they're the majority in the county, they ought to be able to run the county, and so forth and so on. Well, people thought this Black Power meant white exclusion. It never meant that to me, and I don't think it meant that to most of us. But in the organization, there were great disputes about what the course of action ought to be. And eventually, there was a vote within the organization. We were super democratic in SNCC on what to do next. And the question was, what should the white people who work for SNCC do? Should they continue working in Black America as they had done and done well and done effectively? Or should they work in white America where the problem is? It's not black people aren't racist, it's white people who are racist. If we could straighten them out, things would be okay. So we said they ought to work there, and we had a vote on this. The white people who work for SNCC wouldn't vote. And so therefore the proposition carried without their votes, would have been defeated with their votes. And many of them decided to leave the organization. Then we elected Stokely Carmichael as the chairman, and he was a firebrand, a hot guy. He eventually wrote a book, which if you read it today about Black Power, you say, oh, that makes sense to me. But at the time, he let other people tell the public what it meant. And all their explanations were hostile and angry and anti-white. And so this became a bad thing. So the organization began to go into demise and eventually just went away. Mm-hmm. It's a sad thing because we need something like it today.
Julian, how often do you think about those days?
All the time, because I teach it all the time and I see the people all the time. There's a big colony of SNCC people here in Atlanta where I am. I'm going to be with John Lewis tonight with Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's our delegate to the Congress from DC, and she worked for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I'm going to take a civil rights tour beginning in March, beginning in Atlanta, and I'll see John there again. And on the trip, I'll see other SNCC people, other movements. So I see these people all the time. This was a magic moment in my life, working for this organization. Being in the Georgia legislature was an enormous pleasure, and I enjoyed it a great deal. Being chairman of the NAACP was a wonderful thing. Very few people get to do that. But the time I spent with SNCC was really a high point in my life. We had a reunion in April of last year, 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, yeah, because it was our 50th. So it would have been 2010, yeah, okay. And it was, we expected 300 people to come, 1,000 came. And to see these people with whom I'd spent so much time working for civil rights, some of it risky, some of it just a lot of fun, to see them again was just the highlight of my life. It's wonderful. I've never had, it was better than my college reunions, my high school reunions. It was the best time I've ever had.
If you had not devoted your life to racial equality, what do you think you would have been?
I don't know. I had been interested in being a journalist, so I think I might have shifted toward journalism. But who would hire me, I don't know. You know, I worked for this little black newspaper, which is a lot of fun, but that was not a living. It was working.
Right. How would you like to be remembered? 2
ways. I've always thought my headstone, I want a double-sided headstone. On one side, I wanted to say race man, and that means a man who doesn't dislike other races, but who's proud of his own and wants to lift it up. The other side is going to say easily amused. That's the way I want to be remembered.
Well, you've certainly had a wonderful career.
Well, thank you.
Anything else you'd like to talk about?
As I say, I can't remember anything, no.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Julian Bond.
Thank you.